The Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to Planted with Sara Payan. I'm Sara Payan, your host, and we are on episode 4 with our guest, Phil Coturri. Phil Coturri is an American viticulturist. As a vineyard manager, Phil has been recognized as pioneering organic and biodynamic farming in California. He is known as the Wizard of Green and is also the Chief Executive Officer of Enterprise Vineyard Management and co-owner of Winery 16600. He has been highlighted in Wine Spectator, New York Times, various other magazines and newspapers, and we are so lucky to have you here today. Welcome, Phil.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I not only through talking to you, but also reading up on you, I know a lot about what you do and how you started. But for some of our listeners who aren't avid Wine Spectator readers, could you tell them a little bit about your background in the industry and how you came to do what you do?
Well, I grew up with wine in a sense. I was born in San Francisco. My folks bought property when I was 8 years old, 10 years old, somewhere in Glen Ellen, California, in Sonoma County. 1962, I started making wine with my father. At that point, I was 10 years old, and it wasn't something that was foreign to me because my grandfathers were both coopers and they made barrels, both made wines in their basement. So it was something that was always on the table. It was part of our Sunday afternoon family meal that wine was always poured, and so it was something that I grew up with. At 14 years old, I started working in the vineyards that were being planted around our property on Sonoma Mountain. Prior to that, I would do gardening and stuff, and I befriended a retired colonel from the Air Force that actually, I was about 13, they gave me my first copy of Organic Gardening magazine, and taught me about growing tomatoes organically. My father, we always had a garden growing, and we had our ortho products because that was the rage at that time. But then, we moved it to being organic gardeners in our backyards and in our property up in Sonoma. So I just sort of grew up into it. There was never a conscious decision made to work in the wine business, to have a vineyard management company. I went to Sonoma State, worked in vineyards all through the time I was going to college, taught college for a year, kept working in the vineyards. And in 1979, started a bonded winery with my brother on the family property. And the same year, started my vineyard management company, Enterprise Vineyards.
And when did you start 16600?
I started 16600 about 5 years ago with my sons. Excuse me. I wanted to do something a little bit different than I'm not associated with Coturri Winery anymore at this point. I still sell my brother fruit for his project, but I had a little different philosophy, and I wanted to do something with my kids. If you look at the history of wine really is a multi-generational business, and it's something I hope to pass on to both my sons work with me in the vineyard and in the winery, and at some point my grandkids. So that's the dream.
No, that's awesome. I think that there's just such a richness about being able to pass down knowledge from generation to generation, especially with something like cultivation, because there's just so much to know.
And if you grow up around it, you know things without really knowing them. They become second nature. And probably one of the biggest events that occurred in 1979, one of my clients, a man by the name of Myron Freiberg, challenged me to grow his vineyards organically. up to that point, I was schizophrenic. I had, vegetable gardens and orchards I was growing organically, and I was still using paraquat and Roundup in vineyards, and it didn't make sense. And and so I took the big step, and have not looked back since then. I started in 1980, got our first vineyards certified organic, and have not looked back. And how I approach the soils comes from the organic farming culture, or Organic Gardening magazine, and from a lot of my friends in that same era in the early 70s, late 70s, that were getting into growing gardens and how to enrich soils. And there's an art to taking care of soils, and soils are what gives flavor to both wine and to cannabis.
When did you start growing cannabis?
God. When I was in college. I graduated from Sonoma State in 1975, so around that time frame. And the pot cultivation was just starting to happen in California. And it's, this is pre-explosion of Humboldt, where I sort of look at that, the genesis of outdoor pot being grown in California, coming out of the Santa Cruz Mountain area. Mm-hmm. And that's where you sort of started hearing things through the proverbial grapevine about what's going on. And in fact, I have a magazine still that has an article in it by Mountain Girl about, I think it was called Cannabis Tips, or Growing Tips, or something like that. That was published in the Santa Cruz Mountains. That she wrote an article on how to grow pot. So a lot of people were trying to figure out how to do it, and so we didn't have to do all that stuff that was coming in from Mexico.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's really cool that was something from Mountain Girl, because I just saw her a couple months ago, and where she's living now, I heard that she has CBD products that she's actually
right. Yeah, she's doing a nice job up in Oregon with that. That it came out of the culture of the 60s, and definitely inspired me. The culture of the 50s inspired me. One of my mentors was a poet by the name of Gary Snyder, a Zen Buddhist who wrote about times living in the Sierras. Was one of the first ecologists that I came across. And, there was so much that came out of that era that, not that we take it for granted, but it really was our guiding light for the types of foods that we eat, the types of wines that we drink, and the types of pot that we smoke. You had Alice Waters opening up Chez Panisse and giving up people fresh food. Fresh fruits and real food. Not TV dinners that were such the rage as a kid, and but there's foods that my grandparents wanted to make and what they brought from the old country, and from this came the organic movement in California, with people growing vegetables, growing crops, and my crop was growing grapes. And, in lots of ways, I spent the last 40 years, 50 years growing intoxicants, and I want them to be clean and healthy for us, because there's such there's nothing like a great bottle of wine, a great flavor of wine, and the same thing could be said with cannabis.
And when you're looking at that, so you've been doing an organic biodynamic cannabis as well that you've been growing for yourself. Would you call it that?
Oh yeah. I mean, my philosophies are, I don't fertilize my plants, but I enhance the environment in which they grow. That comes from cover crops and from compost, And I will make compost tea and then inject them in my drip systems in both growing pot or growing grapes. And I'll use fish because I'm a big proponent of fish because I love the oils in it and the phosphorus because phosphorus really enhances flowering and flavors. And there's but everything else, I don't use nitrogen because nitrogen has to be grown in the soil by cover crops because then the plant takes what it needs and doesn't become a nitrogen junkie. And nitrogen itself is bitter and gives bitter flavors, both the grapes. And this gives bitter flavors and gives too lush a tissue, which invites more problems, pest problems, mildew problems, mold problems. You want to have hardened off tissues when you're growing plants. So over-fertilization is a detriment, not an asset.
Yeah. With the do you grow your cannabis and grapes side by side?
I have in the past. Right now, I grow pot as a hobby. I love growing the plant. I have a garden, which I'll have I might have 17 different strains, but I only have my 6 plants that I'm allowed to have there. But there'll be a lot of different strains, and it's I love breeding plants. I love seeing how the different strains grow and the flowers that they produce, and it's alongside one of my vineyards. It's that's the beauty of with the legalization of medical marijuana 10, 12 years ago, being able to grow pot out my back door instead of having to grow it and be a guerrilla grower.
Oh yeah.
Might have done that when I was younger, but I'm not that young anymore.
Do you think there are any synergistic effects of growing them near each other?
Well, you know what? I have to be careful that I can't overwater my pot plants because it affects my vines that are downhill of them, and I don't like to. I like to dry farm my vineyard, so there's and to me a perennial plant doesn't need the amount of water that an annual plant does. So that there's they both like the soils that I grow them in, put it that way, and I was. This is really off the wall, but I was talking to a neighbor the other day, and about when the vineyards are younger and they're not producing fruit yet. I would like to use growing CBD hemp in between the rows as a cover crop, and try this. Because then after you harvest the flowers and leave all that carbonaceous material in the cover crop in the ground to help build the soils up, and I thought, wow, I wonder if the county would let me do that, but that's asking a lot at this point.
Yeah, there's a lot of testing and surveys that go into doing all the growing. What was I going to ask you? What you were mentioning about hemp was really interesting. What do you, when you're looking at, actually, I was going to go back to growing outdoors versus indoors and the quality of the flowers. Where do you see the differences with aroma, taste, effect, with something that is of the quality that you grow that is organic, with the sun, versus something that's been carefully cultivated indoors? What have you noticed?
Well, you know what? I won't smoke indoor pot, and I don't. Years ago, having conversations with other farmer friends and talking about, number one, we're growing a medicinal plant, and the best medicine is sunlight, and I understand I understand the necessity for doing it. You know, you wouldn't have a cannabis industry in Colorado if they weren't growing indoors. But where I live in California, in a Mediterranean climate, and I want to plant a seed. In fact, my favorite plants are the volunteers that come up with my garden in the springtime. Because I'll admit it, my plants are not totally seedless because there's always a little seed in it because I have my philosophy behind that also. But you take a plant that's grown by seed in beautiful soil that has never been transplanted, and you don't have to trellis it. It's strong. It has a big trunk, and that taproot has never been changed. To me, those are magical plants, and I think you get better flavors because you're not growing hydroponically. You're not force feeding the plant. You know, it's like I said earlier. I don't want to use a lot of fertilizer on my soils. I want them on my plants. I want them to grow in soils that have been full of carbon, be it through cover crops or the use of compost or the use of compost teas, and that gives you better flavors.
So when I've heard before that having not the easiest landscape for a grape to grow creates better flavors. And if you're applying that to cannabis, that would also mean why sometimes if they're a little stressed out, they might have some seeds, correct? But you're also saying that the environmental exposure creates better flavors as well.
Yes, it does. Yes, and you know what? You can't replicate the fluctuation of temperatures in a greenhouse that occurs outdoors. You know, that as we move into, the equinox is today. Today's the first day of fall, first day of autumn. And the 23rd is usually the 20th or 21st, but this year is the 23rd of September. The light's changing. We're going to have 100-degree temperatures the next 2 days, and it's going to drop down to 70 after that. And those diurnal shifts set flavors in grapes, I think, and it sets flavors in hot also. And it's those diurnal changes, those cold weather that comes in, and all of a sudden a plant will start turning purple. And you can't replicate that indoors. Right. And I'm a dinosaur. I mean, we started growing pot outdoors, and I've worked with indoor growers in the past, and I'm definitely in awe of their discipline, and they're getting 3 or 4 crops a year. I mean, as a farmer, I like taking 4 or 5 months off. It's really nice.
That makes perfect sense.
In wine, they're always talking about terroir. And terroir, sure, the word has its origin in soil, but terroir is soil types, its aspects, its slopes, its elevation, and it's the attitude of the grower. That's what creates a terroir of a great wine. And as I grow Cabernet, the majority of the vineyards I farm are on the Mayacamas mountain range that divides Napa from Sonoma. And the Napa side is east-facing, this Mount Veeder. The Sonoma side is west-facing. It's called the Moon Mountain District. And you taste the two different wines from either side of the mountain, and they're the same varietal. It's this Cabernet or it's Grenache or whatever varietal I might be growing at that particular vineyard. The same plant material, but the flavors are entirely different. The flavors are entirely unique, and that's the beauty of wine, and that's the beauty of growing outdoor marijuana, is that you capture. We call our wine, grapes with a view. You capture flavors with an attitude that comes from the environment in which they're grown. The soils that I have here and the temperatures that I have here are different than what happens up in Mendocino or Humboldt or in the Sierra foothills. But that's the uniqueness of growing outdoor pot. And we've talked about in the past, the ABA for cannabis, and I think it's the best thing in the world. Knowing what you're putting into your body and where it comes from, and celebrate those flavors and those differences. You're in the industry long enough. You have friends from Kauai to Mendocino to the Sierra foothills, and we all celebrate our place of origin in growing and celebrate the flavors of what we grow. Mm-hmm. And everyone has a uniqueness, and that's the beauty of growing great grapes, and that's the beauty of growing great flowers.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of talk and work towards the formalization of appellations for cannabis, and I think that that's really important that we have that, especially because of what you just said, and also as it starts to be accepted federally, hopefully we'll be able to start doing interstate commerce, so people will be able to, just like we now have wines from all over the country, although California, we're known the most for our wines in the United States, but it's always interesting to go different places and try what they have and to see the differences.
Oh yeah, I mean that's how you learn. I remember, this is 8 years ago. I hired a person that was as an intern, and my garden is outside my house and on the side of my vineyard, and I was showing them, and I showed her the plants that I had growing, and she goes, "I didn't know you could grow pot outside." She wasn't from California, but she always associated marijuana from being grown indoors, and I'm going, wow, definitely a different generation than I am, and I grew up, and I just sort of chuckled. I said, well, this is, we're fortunate to be able to grow it outdoors because we have the climate to do it. And it is just a matter of education.
Yeah.
But
what were you going to say?
But the idea of with wine, that's why I love drinking wines from France. I love drinking wines from Italy. I love drinking wines from Napa County. I love drinking wines from Mendocino. I want to be able to taste the soils and taste the landscape of which they're growing in. And so, we'll see how this whole industry evolves over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I'm with you. If there's nothing like the sun. When I first started working in cannabis, we would get some sun grown, but we mostly got indoor grown. And at that time, the sun grown that we were getting, we didn't have the people who know what they're doing with sun grown as well as they do now. I mean, at least not in the dispensaries. I should step back with that. I think sometimes people look at the aesthetics of plants, and because these plants that are grown indoors aren't subjected to the elements, sometimes they can show to be more beautiful.
Yeah. I agree. They're sexier because you have all the crystals are show up. They're not wind blown and messed with by the environment. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder too.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I'm all about a picture of a beautiful bud, but I think for myself personally, at least, I'm more about what it's going to feel like and the potency. Like, I've been so impressed by just the variation feel with outdoor, and also just therapeutically when I work with clients, how much more effective it can be. I just wanted to, before I forget, I wanted to go back to when you were talking about your dream of being able to grow hemp in the times when you're not growing vines in those areas. I'm almost wondering, too, because these plants are bioaccumulators, if it would actually be more helpful for your process of growing organically, too.
Well, there's been a lot of articles written about the bioremediation of growing hemp on soils. It's a magical plant, and because of the prohibition that we've gone through, a lot of the studying of what we could do with it was put on hold, and I think when we going into some of these really screwed up cornfields that have been just full of conventional fertilizers and too much nitrogen and actually poisoned. Switching those over to hemp, and in 2 or 3 years, you're going to see a better quality plant coming out of them. You're going to see more carbon put back into the soils and more biological activity. I mean, and that's the basis of being an organic farmer, is having live soils and having soils that are made alive by plant material being able to compost into those soils. And when that's why in my vineyards I grow massive cover crops. A monoculture is the worst type of farming that you could have, and grapes are a monoculture. But my feeling is in growing grapes is from April 1st to November 1st I grow grapes. And from November 1st to April 1st I grow flowers. I grow, bell beans, I grow clovers. I have various seed mixes to help balance the soils to produce better grapes in the future. And that's the beauty of farming, is enriching the soils, being able to do crop rotations. You can't rotate grapevines, but I could rotate cover crops. So there's so much to learn from any plant and how to make a healthier environment for where we live. And you talk about the therapeutic aspect of it. My therapy, when you're farming as much as I do, I come home and a good friend of mine's mother just recently passed away. She was in her 80s. A real pioneer, and she helped start the Flower Mart in San Francisco, and supplied flowers and produce down at the Ferry Building Farmers Market. And she said that every day you got to spend at least 10 minutes in your garden. And during the growing season, after putting up with employees and clients, I go home and I spend more than 10 minutes in my garden. I have my tomatoes and I have my pot plants, and I watch the flowers grow up. And there's such a therapy to that, to growing it, to seeing the change. And that 10 minutes is what grounds me. And I'm in the soil all the time, but that 10 minutes walking through my garden is what makes my day better for the next day. And the other thing that she said was that your garden should only be as big as it's not a hassle. If it becomes a hassle, your garden's too big. And I keep thinking about that. Maybe I only should have 1 acre of grapes instead of 700. But I like biodiversity.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Well, when you decide to pare down, are you going to have Sam take care of the rest of it?
We'll figure it out. I have both my sons are involved in it, and my grandson likes to ride on tractors, so we'll see what happens. And it's an inevitable thing. It's like I said, grape growing is a multi-generational business. It's a lifestyle, and farming in California is a lifestyle. And what's exciting about the legalization of marijuana in the United States and California is, number one, it happened in my lifetime, and I see an industry, that it's almost too industrial and it's too corporate. But the wine industry went through the same growing pains, and it's still going through the same growing pains. and you're always going to have your $2 chucks. You're always going to have your pre-rolls coming out of a dispensary, but then you're always going to have that bottle of vintage wine that just knocks your socks off after 20 years, and you're always going to have that nice bud grown on somebody with love in the full sunshine on a mountain slope. That just the beauty of it and the aroma of it just stops you in time. And I think I look forward to the stratification of the cannabis business, so that both those types exist. But the one I want to be involved in, and I look forward to is that upper 2 percentile that maintains the art of growing plants, where it's not for it's for commerce, because you can't separate all that stuff out. But there's an art in growing it, and that art becomes the capturing of the sunlight, and it's great. And I think we'll see that over the next 10 years.
I hope so, because when we were just medical, we just had a very different landscape. There were so many boutique growers. There were so many amazing flowers to be had. And right now we've got a little bit of a desert going on right now. It's the corporatization of cannabis, though, it's a natural part of legalization. It has changed the landscape for individual growers, especially with the distribution models that are in place now. What you're saying reminds me of back in like the late 80s, early 90s, when even microbreweries started coming up for beer too. That when I was in college, I worked at a newly formed microbrewery, and it was really interesting to see people having more of an artisan interest. And I really, really hope that it's sooner than later, because I feel like we're going to lose some of these amazing genetics that we used to have access to.
Oh, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. But I think I do think that I'm not alone in what I do, and I'm 20 years ago that were the big pot going on, and the genetics was starting, and people were working with it. I have a friend again who in Hawaii who has 300 different strains, and that go back to the original Quiet Electric, and the original Santa Marta Gold seeds from that, and it's those obsessed people that grow great orchids in the world, and their passion is not to make money off of growing the orchids, but they just grow the orchids to keep and breed the orchids to keep these strains alive and create new ones. And I think that that these are the people that will rise to the top, that we need to cultivate to the top, because they're the ones that understand the beauty of the plants. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that's
that's getting out there, but there is some incredible genetics that have, when you clone things too many times, it's a clone. When you use the mystery of seed and the R factor of that you create a new, that's why we don't want to clone people. We want to create new babies. We want something that is definitely has a heritage, but has its own personality. And that's growing.
That's something that is sometimes hard to explain to people who visit a dispensary, especially when they come in and their favorite flower is out, that we've lost touch with the fact that what we're dealing with is a plant that needs to grow. It's not something that's manufactured in a factory with a machine. And I guess one thing I would like you, if you could, explain what happens when we just continue going from clone to clone with a particular flower.
I have grown clones. People have given them to me, and to me, they're not the strongest plant, and they tend, you constantly have to keep the mother plant made fresh from the clone. But to me, the most amazing thing because in the garden I grow, the areas I'm growing, I've grown pot for the last 15 years, and because of be it neighbors or the rogue male that pops its head, and there's always a little bit of seed that gets bred in there, and I get volunteer plants in my garden, and when you have a plant that grows from a volunteer, from a seed, and it's never transplanted, it grows there. You don't have to trellis it. You have a trunk on it that gets the size of my arm, and and even though it could have been a Stilton, an OG, or whatever its genetics came from, to me that's a new strain that has become indigenous to the area where it's being grown, and that takes all the strength. It's like the survival of the fittest, and that's the basics of genetics. When the one plant that comes up and goes through fruition and reaches reproductive fulfillment, you got a very well balanced, healthy plant. Mm-hmm. And I think you get more. There's more magical properties to it than something that's just another clone that's grown under lights.
Right. Yeah, I think that's where I look at like kind of the separation of like the heart and soul of cannabis with just manufacturing something over and over to fill a need, is that you do lose a lot of those amazing qualities, and I wonder about the impact of the therapeutic qualities as we start to get into more research, because one thing we're seeing is that having, like, for me, when I went through cancer, I tried Marinol, which was synthetic THC. It was not helpful. We've shown through research that, you need to have the full spectrum of what's showing up in your cannabis to achieve optimal therapeutic results. And I'm wondering if we're eventually going to turn back to having things be more outdoor because it's more efficient, or if we're going to be looking at more commercialization, more, I guess, like institutionalization of cannabis, where hubris is going to set in again, and we're going to start having subpar cannabis available because it can be easily replicated, and they're not as concerned about the bigger picture.
Well, I think you're so correct in that, and with growing indoors, you could get through lights and breeding, you could get stronger and stronger, higher percentages of THC, but it's just not THC that you want. You want the full spectrum of the alkaloids that are in the plant, of the flavors that are in the plant. It's just like you need a little bit of THC to make the CBD work better in your body, and the best way of doing that is growing it outdoors, growing it in sunlight, and but at the same time, there's not, the whole world is not a beautiful climate like we have in parts of California and other areas, and I think there'll be adaptations. It's an adapting plant, and you look at photos of plants growing in high elevation in the Himalayas, and they have a shorter growing season. They get to full maturity. The buds might not be as big as something coming out of the backwoods of Humboldt, but boy, they're beautiful, and they're complete. And so that's the beauty of pot of the cannabis plant, is it becomes really adaptive to the environment in which it's grown. That's why it does so well indoors, but I just think they're missing something. And I think, it's so perfect for our society to have everything taste the same, everything be the same amount of THC, the same amount of flavors, the same amount of alcohol, and the same. There's no fluctuation. But I get bored of it. I want fluctuation. I want, and that's when they talk about vintage wines. it's reflecting the vintage. In 2018, we had 2 inches of rain in October, and that changed the grape vintage. And it also changed my plants in my garden because they got rained on, and so that's the environment that you can't control indoors. You can't create randomness indoors. Mm-hmm. And you could try to grow grapes and make the same type of wine every day, but that gets boring. So, I don't know. I just like to express the site and once it's grown. And that's a correlation that I see between the two plants.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever encountered the auto-flowering plants, the ones that are crossed with ruderalis?
I've seen them, but I've never grown one myself. My friend has, and I saw one when I was in Hawaii.
Mm-hmm. I find that fascinating because then that's creating regular flowering because of the influence of the ruderalis plant. And I'm just wondering, how do you think that impacts what the final product?
Well, Sarah, what I'd have to do is grow for 2 years. I could come up with maybe an intelligent answer to that question.
Well, I'll ask you in 2 years.
So I'll do some research and maybe I could get some of those plants growing in my garden next year.
I'm always curious.
I mean, that's the beauty of it when I'm given different seeds to be able to play with, and seeing the variations that come out of 5 seeds from the same plant, and how the coloration might be a little bit different. There's definitely similarities, but I see that in grapevines too. When I'm propagating a vineyard, I do all-field propagation. We plant rootstock, then we go through and pick out what we consider is the best clone of Cabernet or best clone of Grenache, and then we'll go through a vineyard and pick out the plants that we like the way they look the best, and take cuttings off of those and graft them onto our plants. To keep paring down the genetics and get what we want. And in France, there's a Massal selection is where you get all these different strains of say it's Cabernet, and instead of having it all be the same clone from this one particular numbered clone, it's a Massal. It's Cabernet. It might come from 5 different plots, and those to me produce the most interesting wines. Sometimes it's hard to convince a winemaker of that, but once the ones that embrace that, they like that randomness of selection. Mm-hmm. And that's what in growing vintage wines, which essentially is what my company does. That you look for the best quality, not so much the best tonnage, but in fact, sometimes, we might cut off half the fruit that a plant could possibly carry just to get the best flavors to make the best wines. And that's, there's a man in Massimo that grows peaches. I met him at a talk at Champagny again, where, that when a peach comes out, there's the flowering of it. There's 5 or 6 flowers that happen, and you got to thin it down to 1 or 2 out of the 6. And you want to try to get the ones that grow perfectly and have complete sunlight. And you only have a sixth of what you possibly could have grown. But if you had it all 6, they would have gone into canned peaches. But to grow the perfect fresh peach to put on your plate and encapsulate the aroma of what a peach is, you take 2 out of the 6, and that's how I approach growing grapes, and that's sort of how I approach my garden in my backyard. So less is more in lots of ways.
Yeah, well, it's a huge undertaking, I think, to get people to understand the amount of care that it takes to create good produce, whether that be, some people do consider cannabis produce. I mean, it is a plant. But whether you're looking at fruit, vegetables, what have you.
Yeah. Well, in what I'm doing, I'm growing cut flowers, and And you know, there's nothing like a cut flower that you have at your table that fills the room up with an incredible aroma when you walk in, be a beautiful rose. The same can be said of a nice fresh bud. During this time of the year, I like to bring one into the house every night to show my wife that it's still fresh, because I love the aromas.
Oh, it's so beautiful. I remember the first time I was, not the first time I had smelled it, but the first time I was able to bring it for other people to experience. I was teaching an education class to Chinese medicine practitioners, and especially because of the immense stigma around cannabis and how, in that area in particular, and just how we have become desensitized to what cannabis is because we either see it dried or processed in edibles. I actually brought a bouquet of fresh flowers to class, and they were amazed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the beauty and intricacy of the flower, and granted, they get that indoors too. There's some beautiful flowers grown, and like we said earlier, sometimes a flower grown indoors looks sexier than one grown outdoors. But eye is in the beauty of the beholder, and I'll say that. And I don't, my crystals might be embedded in the flowers a little bit more because of the winds and the environment, and as they cure, they become more combustible, and there's the art and science of growing pot, and the art part sometimes gets forgotten, and in the art is the magic and the medicinal part of it.
What are you seeing as far as growing and cannabis culture where you're living? And I know, like, a lot of times people like to be a little bit more dramatic about, weed and wine, they don't work together, they're competitors. And there's a lot of us who don't look at it that way. I mean, for example, you've been quoted in articles. There's also wonderful things like the Wine and Weed Symposium that are happening. But what are you seeing?
Well, there's. I don't think there's competition between the two. Both wine and cannabis, pot, marijuana, whatever you want to call it, have been around for centuries, and they don't go after. They're not going after. They're not competing market. The person that is going to use a fine wine and likes to smoke pot is not going to choose one or the other. And I think that there's always been a celebratory aspect to both sitting around with a bunch of friends, passing a joint, sitting around with a bunch of friends, sharing a bottle of wine. There's that celebratory aspect that has gone on again for hundreds of years, and as far as them maturing together, I think because we're in the wine country, you can't separate them out, and I think there's as much, and there's definitely, you could grow pot in areas where you can't grow wine, and like as you just said, there's a therapeutic aspect of walking through a pot garden, grown outdoors. That's the same thing as visiting a vineyard and a winery, walking through, and seeing the magic of grapes being harvested and going through that alchemical transition that occurs from sugar to alcohol. That you get sunlight into THC. There's definitely all these similarities, and will they become the same tourist industry? Yeah, they're definitely trying it, but as long as one is federally regulated and the other one is federally banned, it's not going to happen really soon, because the investment that I have into my wines, I don't want to lose it through some because the federal laws prohibit the two being together, and I got to be real. of that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's an unfortunate and very true fact.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing not only how just the two areas coexist, but in the future, when a lot of that changes on the federal side, what can actually happen with wine and cannabis. Although I always tell people, be really careful when you're using both together. If you don't know what you're doing, especially if you're having your wine and then you're smoking afterwards, because crossfading is no joke.
No, it isn't. And I'm there's a lot of experience definitely is educational. But I tell you, at 67 years old, I'm so happy to see cannabis being legal, and I see it. I see the whole industry being a little bit chaotic, and I see it. But to me, if I was, I'm anxious to see what occurs over the next 10, 20 years. I think we are going to see a stratification of cannabis, and there'll be times when you retire after a night with a nice glass of brandy or a great bottle of wine, and go into the other room and have a joint and a wine at the same time. I mean, we've been doing it for years anyway, so why not be able to do it out in the open?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Phil, I just want to thank you for being on the show today. And I also, on a non-cannabis note, but definitely going back to what we were talking about, friends sharing wine, also good food. You all have an event at Winery 16600 regularly that combines that and music, don't you?
Yeah, Bottle Sundays. We had one yesterday. We do 4 a year. We got one coming up, I think the last weekend in October, and actually I'm going to try to get you to come up and bring your paramour with you to help us to sing with David Gans is we're going to be playing and broadcasting from the winery that same day. I think it's October 28th or something. I have to look at the calendar. In October 27th, David Gans will be playing, and there'll be art and wine and music.
We always love coming checking out. Last time we came up, David was playing, and that was great. And he does his Sirius radio broadcast from your place, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, if I am not on the East Coast doing some education, then we will definitely be there because we always love spending time with you guys, and we love your wine.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and it's always fun seeing you, and I love the work that you're doing, and hopefully I made some sense about the fun of my life. Yes,
thank you, because I think it's really important. I get a lot of people from the industry, whether it's working with the product itself or policy, and I think that it's really important to hear from people like yourself who are pioneering in general cultivation, and also what you do is so closely related to the cultivation of cannabis, and you also were cultivating cannabis. So I think that it was a really rich conversation, and I think that because we've been talking about wine for so much longer out in the open, now that we're getting into normalization, actually using the reference to wine and some of the similarities helps people have a better understanding and conversation. And I always say conversation is normalization.
Yeah, and it's the descriptors of flavors, and there's a big overlap in those descriptors, and we're always trying to figure out how to articulate the experience, and conversation definitely does that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our conversation 2 years from now when you've got your auto flowering game in check.
Yeah, well, Back in 2 years, this is what I think.
Phil Coturri, everybody, thank you so much. Next month, we'll have another exciting guest, and please join us again on the Radio Misfits Network. Thank you so much, Phil.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye.